All right, guys, so here we are again, Human Geography. It's Miss Levy, and we are finishing up Unit 3, our wrap-up. This is the second video. So in the first video where we left off, we were talking about bilingualism. Bilingualism is when a country has more than one official language, and you have multiple languages spoken within your country. And again, this bilingualism for an individual can be very good, being able to interact with other cultures and communicate. But for a country that has this obvious division, it can be very negative. It can create cultural tension. That cultural tension would be between those separate minority groups or separate culture groups. Like if you speak different languages, typically you'll be from a separate culture group. Centrifugal or divisive political forces as groups. One of the most significant unifying forces for a country is language and a common belief system. Common language, common belief system. And when you have different languages spoken by your people in your own country, this can be very divisive and can be a very negative political force. It can challenge the unity of the country because like in Canada, the French Quebecians, they identify with that culture group more than being Canadian. And so that separate culture can be a challenge to their unity. Can be a very high cost to education because when you have multiple official languages, they do have to educate their people in multiple languages. It can be a significant economic disadvantage and cost because they do have to, for all government business, they do have to say it in both English and in French in Canada. So they would have to say it in both of the languages. They have to print all the information in both languages. They have to provide all the documentation in both languages. And so this higher cost can be an economic disadvantage. It can be external threat from that common language, that culture in other countries called irredentism. What that can be is let's say in Russia and Ukraine and this idea of the annexing Crimea. Russia's argument was that Crimea is more similar, it's Russian. They speak Russian languages, they're Russian in culture, so it was only natural for them to take control of that part of Crimea from Ukraine. That can be that when you have that separate culture and defined by the language, and it's similar to a culture from another country, it can present that threat. Next, let's talk about how pop culture can diffuse globally. So we know that pop culture, the whole purpose of pop culture is to diffuse. It is to appeal to everyone. It's to make money. And we talked about folk and pop culture, that folk culture, that it changes from place to place at any point in time. Like folk culture doesn't tend to change very much over time. It's very different from place to place, meaning that the indigenous Native American tribes in the United States are very different from the indigenous Native tribes in Africa, who are very different from the indigenous Native tribes in Australia. And so it'll be different from place to place over time or at the same time. Whereas pop culture tends to be the same from place to place, but it does differ from time to time, meaning that what was cool in 1985 was cool whether you were in the United States, whether you were in France, whether you were in Europe, or whether you were in Russia, or whether you were in Australia. It was cool from place to place to place. But what was cool in 1985 was not what was cool in 1992, because pop culture differs from time to time rather than from place to place. So it tends to be the same from place to place, but it differs from time to time. And pop culture tends to diffuse globally from things like internet, as people can access this via internet, or they can send information via internet, email, social media like Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, celebrities spreading pop culture all over the world. And most celebrities like Kylie Jenner, they do use social media, email, internet to spread that pop culture. TV, like TV shows and TV commercials, radio, movies, spreading that pop culture. So what movies tend to be popular in the United States are popular in other places in the world. Computers, phones, newspapers, streaming services like YouTube, Netflix, and Hulu. YouTube is very common now in a way that spreads pop culture. Music will spread that pop culture. Plays, books, comic books, all sorts of other cultural like manga and anime, manga, or however you say that, and anime, magazines, podcasts, language learning programs, graphic t-shirts with any kind of term. All of those are ways that pop culture diffuses globally. We know that this is mostly celebrities through social media, internet, TV, movies, radio. Also, how does pop culture language, how does that diffuse through hierarchical diffusion? We know hierarchical diffusion is that it starts from a person or a place of influence and it trickles down from there. So it can be celebrities start to use the new word and then spread it down to others through the social hierarchy, or people in large cities start to use the word and then the word eventually gets to smaller places or media markets, or reverse hierarchy where the minority use of the term spreads up the social ladder to majority. That's how hip-hop spread and hip-hop language. It was a minority group that spread up through to the majority. Next, let's talk about how pop culture language can diffuse through contagious diffusion. Again, contagious means that once you're exposed to it, then you are impacted. So an individual individuals use the new word, and then acquaintances, those who are close to them, begin to use that word as well. So that's the contagious, whereas cool people use it and people around them and their groups use it too. It can also be like if you are, I know it's hierarchical diffusion from celebrities down, but it can also be that if you subscribe to a celebrity's or a particular group's Facebook page or fan page or their Twitter or their Instagram, because you are subscribing, once those people put out those ideas or that language, then you are exposed to it. So that's a way it spreads through contagious diffusion as well. Next, how does pop culture language spread through relocation diffusion? Again, relocation is a person moves and takes it with them. So a person who uses a certain term moves to a new location and they continue to use that term in the new location and it spreads from there. This is obviously the slowest way that it can spread. Or a form of media in which the term is used is relocated to a new place and the term is used in the new place. This would be like if you have a news station, let's say like Fox News, that then relocates to another location and they continue to use the same words and language in that new location, then it would spread to that group as well, like Fox to Sky News maybe. Next, let's talk about what could be barriers to the diffusion of pop culture language. There are all sorts of barriers to, obviously, diffusion of pop culture. It can be like distance or physical barriers that prevent it from occurring, age barriers or generation gap, like young people are trying to talk a certain way and the older generation doesn't like it, so it just doesn't spread to them. They don't translate readily into other languages. That would be a linguistic barrier, where the language doesn't translate properly, so it just doesn't make any sense. People reject it and they act to protect their language from external influences. Religious barriers, so the language goes against, or the phrases go against that, the belief system. Political barriers, like the internet or media censorship, would be like in North Korea. This would be folk or local culture desiring to protect their own local or folk culture, so they reject it or they insulate themselves from it by censorship. Ethnic culture, desire to maintain distinctiveness or identities. They may insulate themselves from that influence. Social class barriers, like those people with limited access to social media or digital media or technology won't gain access to it. Economic barriers, people don't have access to movies and celebrities and TV and radio, and so they just it doesn't affect them in any way. They don't get those new words. Next, let's go over the Kurgan and the Renfrew theories again. Remember, these are the theories of the origin of the Proto-Indo-European language family. So where did the original Indo-European superfamilies, where did they originate and how did they evolve? And so they differ in place of origin, author, and how they evolved. So again, this is the Kurgan versus the Renfrew. In the Kurgan theory, they believe that the people, this evolved where the people whose homeland was in the steppes of the northern border between present-day Russia and Kazakhstan. And the Renfrew believed that it was in present-day Turkey, then called Eastern Anatolia. So the Kurgan said it was more in the Russian area, Kazakhstan. Renfrew said no, it was mainly in Turkey, which was then Eastern Anatolia. In the Kurgan theory, the author is Gambatis. In the Renfrew theory, this is Colin Renfrew. And the date of origin, Kurgan says that the Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European superfamily, that this original language was from 4300 BC. So that would be basically 6,300 years ago. But the Renfrew says that these people lived 2,000 years even before the Kurgan. So this would be like 6,300 BC. So over 8,000 years ago. And they differ also on how they diffused. The Kurgan said that it was by warfare, that the nomadic herders were among the first to domesticate horses and cattle. So they were able to go eastward to Siberia, westward through Europe, and southeast to Iran and South Asia between 3,500 and 2,500 BC. And they used their horses and weapons and conquered much of Europe and South Asia, and then obviously spread that Proto-Indo-European, the original language, throughout that. That's why those branches are spread, that Indo-European is spread through there. Renfrew says no, but it was actually through agriculture, through farming, that they were able to move westward to Greece, into Italy, Sicily, Corsica, Mediterranean coast of France, Spain, and Portugal, north towards central and northern France, and onto the British Isles, also into the Danube River, which would be like through Germany, west to Central Europe, north to the Baltic Sea, east to the homeland of the Kurgans. And that this diffused with the agricultural practices because the speakers became more populated, they could feed themselves and more wealthy, so that it spread through agriculture. They could sustain larger populations because they could feed themselves. All right, guys, so this I believe, let me just double check to make sure. Yeah, this is the last slide here in our presentation about the Unit 3 wrap-up.